Hey guys, it's Katie, and I'm here today to do my mid-year wrap-up. I thought about doing something like this a couple of months ago because I won't be able to read from the end of May all the way up to mid-August sometime. So I figured I'd tell you briefly about all of the books that I've read so far this year. And I'm not going to go into much depth because I have done wrap-ups detailing my thoughts on each of these books, and I've done reviews on some of these books. So if you want more in-depth things on that, I will link my wrap-up playlist and my review playlist up above so you guys can get a better feeling of some of my thoughts on these. But I wanted to do this just to kind of like mark my year so far and just talk about my progress and just general events that have happened so far. Once again, this is an experiment. I don't know if I'm going to do this, something like this ever again, but I figured why not? So without further ado, let's jump into everything. So far in 2019, from January through late mid May, I have read 32 things. And I'm surprised that I managed to finish my Goodreads goal at this point. I had 30 books down and I'm surpassed it at this point. I'm up to 32 books. So back in January, I read quite a bit. I always tend to read a lot in January for whatever reason. I just read a ton during that month. And this year, it really helps because I went on vacation. And when I was in Cayman Islands, and I read, I think, like 5 things while I was on vacation. So, the first book I read this year and the first book I read on vacation, or continued on vacation, was Girl in the Tower by Katherine Arden, which is the second book in the Winternight trilogy, and I definitely really enjoyed that one. I really love that trilogy, and it's one of my favorite trilogies now. Girl in the Tower was really enjoyable. It just kind of picked up right where book one left off and goes from there. Then the second book that I read while I was on vacation was Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. This was a reread for me several times over. I've read Peter Pan many times, and I decided to read that while I was on vacation there because I read it when I was there when I was a lot younger, and I just have very fond memories of reading that there. So that was a very enjoyable reread. And I read Shibumi by Trevannion, and that's kind of an espionage thriller novel that is centered around an Eastern form of chess called Go. It's a very intellectual game, but there's a lot of espionage, assassiny, political thriller aspects to it. And I really enjoyed it, but there were parts that did lag a little bit at times, but for the most part, I really enjoyed it, like a lot more than I was expecting to. Then I read Hook, which is another one that I read on vacation. It's kind of I don't want to call it a Peter Pan retelling because it's not, but it is a Captain Hook retelling. I really liked it, but like it took me a while to get into it, but I loved their explanation and their take on Captain Hook's origin story and how he became the way he did. I just really loved it, and it was just like, at least to me, it was like heavily implied that Hook was bisexual, and I was just a fan of that. But I mean, nothing explicit, of course, but I had a love-hate relationship with that book because there were definitely certain aspects of it that I didn't like. But overall, I liked Hook's story, which was primarily what was being told there. So yeah, kind of on the fence about how I felt about that one. And then I read The Sea of Monsters by Rick Riordan. I read other Rick Riordan books, but I'm going in order here, guys, so just bear with me. But yeah, The Sea of Monsters was the last book I read on vacation, and I really enjoyed it. It was just so fun, especially reading it by the ocean. It was just it just added an extra atmospheric feel to it, and I think that in some ways that made me enjoy it more than I may have if I read it in a different setting. But I still really enjoyed it. And I just loved the story that it was telling, and it was just a really fun, nostalgic read, even though I've never read Rick Riordan before, or, I read The Lightning Thief last year, but I've never read his books before. This is my first time reading them. I really enjoyed that experience. And then once I got home, I read The Winter of the Witch by Katherine Arden, which is the final book in the Winternight trilogy. I loved it so much. It could be argued that that's one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year. I just loved the atmosphere. I loved how it tied everything up. I loved the characterization. I just loved everything about it. It was really just taking both books and both worlds that we got to experience in some ways and kind of melding it all together. And I just loved how it all tied up. And then I read a bunch of books over the polar vortex adventure that we were having, because February was a time. So the first book I read was The Titan's Curse by Rick Riordan. Then I read The Battle of the Labyrinth by Rick Riordan and The Last Olympian by Rick Riordan. And then finally Percy Jackson and the Demigod Files, or whatever it's called. It's like the short story collection. So yeah, I read those 4 books over kind of polar vortex week, or around that time period, and I enjoyed all of them. Once again, it's just continuation of the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. I would probably say The Battle of the Labyrinth is my favorite of the 4, that out of those 4. But I definitely enjoyed all of them. But the Demigod Files, I didn't love that much. It was not great. It wasn't. I just didn't enjoy that collection very much. There was a short story / novella in there that wasn't terrible, but the other ones just didn't work. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that Rick Riordan is not made for short stories, basically. Then the next book I read was actually a short story, and it's The Hope of Elantris, and it's kind of an outtake from Elantris. Like, it's meant to either be read post Elantris or after a specific chapter in the book that's more towards the end. It was okay. I feel like I would have probably enjoyed it more if I'd read it right after, but I didn't do that. I waited almost a year to read that, and so I just didn't feel like I got as much as I could have out of it. And it's definitely not my favorite Brandon Sanderson work, but it definitely did add something. So I would recommend that if and when you read Elantris, that you read The Hope of Elantris either right after the chapter you're supposed to read it in, or right after the end of the book, because I have a feeling you'll like it more if you do it that way rather than wait a period of time. And then I read Circe by Madeline Miller, and of course I loved Circe. I love Madeline Miller and her writing, and she's definitely one of my favorite authors now. I mean, I loved The Song of Achilles when I read it last year, and they're very different. Like, I don't like it when people compare them because they're not comparable, but that's a story for another time. I actually go into I talk a little bit about that in my review of it, but I really, really like Circe. It basically, if you've read the Odyssey, Circe is a witch, and she is ultimately banished to an island to live in solitary confinement because of something that she did. And it's just kind of about her journey and her life, basically. It's very, very character-centric. It's not a very plot-driven book, but there is a ton packed in there because it does span centuries. And it's just really interesting to watch, especially as someone who is really quite well versed in the original myths and everything. I just really enjoyed it. But one thing I would say is if you're not super well versed in Greek mythology, you're not going to necessarily pick up on all the nuances and all the characters that are being discussed and talked about even in passing, because like for me, for instance, it's like I know why this person is important. I know why they're just randomly name dropping them and why they're there. But for someone who isn't familiar with the myths, it would be like, who is this person? Why are they randomly being thrown in here? I don't care. Because they might never be brought up again, but in the grand scheme of things, they are very important. So that's like maybe one thing I would mention, but I personally loved this book all whole time. Then the next book I read was Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. You guys know my thoughts on Leigh Bardugo. Six of Crows was pretty definitely better than Grisha. I will say that, but I was just kind of overall meh on it. I was very apathetic. I didn't really care about the characters or about anybody, but it was better, so I call that a slight win. And then I read Fear, Trump in the White House by Bob Woodward, and I want to say I enjoyed it because I did. I enjoyed the story that Bob Woodward was telling. I enjoyed the way he was telling it. It was very informative. It put a lot of things into a different perspective, which is something I like doing when it comes to current events, especially stuff like this. So it was definitely a very interesting perspective to get on things that I already know about because it's everywhere all the time. But it did take me a little bit of time to get through, primarily because of the topic, and you know, it's a difficult thing to read, but I would say that this is a good book to read if you want to get a little bit more knowledge on the subject matter, because Bob Woodward knows his stuff. He's been in this field for quite a long time. Then we get to arguably my most disappointing book of the year, and that is Green Rider by Kristen Britton. I was not too keen on this book. I think I went in with too high expectations, and I just built it up to be something in my head, and when it was not that thing, it was just not a good time. But besides my expectations, there were other aspects of the book that really just did not work. The plot was all over the place, the characters were pretty flat, the writing was lazy and sloppy, in my honest opinion. The world building could have been good, but because of all of those other elements that were kind of lacking, it didn't work as well as I wanted it to. I will say the last third, things did start to get better, but not enough to make me want to continue on with the series. It took a lot of thought and consideration for me to come to the conclusion to not continue, because I'm typically one who is just like a pure completionist at heart, even if I'm not too keen on the first book. On occasion, I do make that decision to stop, and my disappointment was too great for me to want to push on with this one. Who knows if my thoughts will change in the future, but really, I just don't see it happening, at least anytime soon. Then the next one I read was The Bouknights, and this is a dystopian Arthurian legend retelling, and it was interesting, but it was also weird, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. In a lot of ways, it definitely had its moments where it was really interesting and really well done, but then there were other moments where I was like, what? And I love Arthurian legend and Arthurian retellings and things, so it was just kind of a weird experience reading that book, but it was interesting anyway. Then next in March, it was Middle Grade March, and I participated in that, not doing prompts or anything, but I did read some middle grade. The first one being Dragon Rider by Cornelia Funke. And this book took me by surprise. This is one of those books that I've had on my shelf since I was like 10 or 11, and it's been staring at me. And I finally decided to pick it up, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Basically, it takes all of this different dragon lore and kind of weaves a story into it. It's kind of like the West meeting the East, and I really liked that. But there are a lot of other interesting creatures in it as well. I talk about it in more depth in my wrap up for March, but I definitely really enjoyed this book, and I don't want to go into too much depth on it because I don't want to spoil you guys if you do choose to read it, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think there's a sequel that came out fairly recently, like within the last year or so, or something like that. And I'll be interested to pick that up one day. Then the next book I read was Nevermore, The Trials of Morgan Crow by Jessica Townsend. And this is a book that's pretty well loved on BookTube. And I definitely did enjoy it, but I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as everyone else did, I don't think. I had some issues with the writing and the plot. There were just so many convenient things that were going on, and so many plot holes and things like that. The characters were really interesting. My favorite was a side character, and I loved the world building. That was definitely its strength. And I'm definitely going to plan on picking up the second book, which is Wondersmith, I believe. But I didn't love that book as much as everyone else. I definitely did enjoy it, and I definitely did love a lot of it, but there were just some things that detracted from that enjoyment a little bit. And then I read Bilbo's Last Song by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is a poem, song thing that takes place right at the end of The Return of the King, right before Bilbo and Frodo go to the Undying Lands. It's just a cute, illustrated song, story, poem thing. But the problem that I had with it was I decided to get it on ebook, and that's a mistake. Don't do it, because the illustrations are in black and white, and they're like, oh, as you can see, this character in the red hat. And I'm like, no, I see gray, but I can figure it out based on the vicinity of the where the name is in the caption, but that definitely detracted a little bit. But that's nobody's fault except for my own. So maybe one day I will get myself a copy in physical form so I can enjoy it the way it's supposed to be enjoyed. And then I read a novella called The Gateway by L.J. Andrews, and I had very mixed thoughts and feelings on this book. It's a prequel to an overarching series called The Lost Relics, I think. And I hadn't read any of the other books, but I got that one for a really cheap price on Amazon. So I just decided to read it. And I have a feeling you're supposed to read the other, like the series, before you read the prequel. Like you'll have a better understanding of things. And I think that is what, or at least part of what, detracted from my enjoyment. But also just some of the writing and felt a bit rushed. And some of the characters just didn't seem fleshed out or something. And so I'm not sure how I feel about it overall. But it did have some intriguing and interesting concepts and plot points and things like that. So I'm just kind of taking a step back to determine if it's something that I want to jump into. But I definitely did enjoy it for the most part. So we'll see. Then the next one I read, I loved a whole ton until the very end. And that is The Summer of Katya by Trevannion. This is a psychological thriller novel that follows our main protagonist, Jean, I think is what his name is. And he becomes obsessed with this girl. Her name is Katya. and he's always over at her house and his family. He's a doctor, and he is treating her brother because he broke his shoulder, collarbone, whatever, details. And so he's over there all the time, and he's wanting to get to know Katya more because he's, madly in love with her. And it takes you on this very interesting journey of like social interaction and as I said, psychological thrillery things. And I really, really enjoyed it. It's definitely a character-centric novel because it's just literally following all of these interactions that Jean has with all of these characters in the Trevel family. And as I said, it's really well done and well crafted, but the ending, it's just, it ruins a lot of it, honestly. I just was so frustrated with the ending, and I can't tell you anything about it because it's very, very spoilery. But yeah, it was annoying. Yeah. And I mean, like, pretty much the only reason I read this book is because it has my name in it. Like, that's the only reason I read this book. And my parents remembered really enjoying it. But then I asked them about it, and they're like, yeah, I don't remember this book. I'm like, it's on your shelf, but whatever. So I really enjoyed it, and I, yeah. But at the same time, I had some issues with it. So, double-edged sword, as per usual. And then also in March, I read The Land of Silver Apples by Nancy Farmer, and that's the second book in the Sea of Trolls trilogy. And it was just so nice to be with the characters again and going on another crazy mythological journey. Because, I mean, it's just such a unique trilogy. It's not something that I feel like I've seen done before or done well before, because especially since it's Norse based. But I really liked it. Once again, it wasn't as good as the first one in my opinion, but it's still worth it in general just to continue on with the story. And yeah, I really liked that one. For The Nine Tailors by Dorothy L. Sayers, and this is a medieval murder mystery novel. And honestly, I don't know what it was. It might have been the writing because it was very dense and flowery. But I just found myself drifting a lot. There were certain chapters I was really, really engaged in. But it was definitely not my favorite novel by any means. Like, it was an interesting premise and an interesting, like, overall novel. But the execution kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and I didn't love it. But, like, I also did kind of like it. I don't know. I have very weird feelings on this book. Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about that book, I think. And then is another one of my favorite books of the year so far, and that is Tears of the Salamander by Peter Dickinson. Wow, I loved that book so much. I wasn't sure about it. I just kind of got it on a whim one time. Like, I saw it mentioned or something on Goodreads one time, and I was like, oh, okay, that sounds kind of, intriguing, and, it's middle grade and whatnot. But then I got it because I was able to get it for a really, really reasonable price. I was like, yeah, okay, sure, I'll try this out. And I fell in love with this book. It was so good. And after having a lot of like very mediocre, disappointing, like not as captivating reads, I literally was addicted to this book. First of all, it has its own soundtrack with it because it's based on all of this church choir music, which I loved. The premise was fascinating. It was something I've never seen before. I mean, you hear about dragons all the time, but instead of dragons, it was salamanders, and I just loved that. The world building was just so phenomenal, honestly. The plot, as I said, was very unique. The characters were interesting, but I mean also very predictable in their ways of things. And the writing, while simplistic, was definitely really interesting to me. Definitely one that I really enjoyed, and I will definitely recommend it to you guys because it needs more love. I don't think it has great ratings on Goodreads for whatever reason, but like, I'm honestly gonna tell you guys, please give this book a read, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Then the next book I read is The Light Fantastic by Terry Pratchett. This was another one that was okay. It's a continuation of the Discworld series, and it picks up right where The Color of Magic left off. So we're with our characters Twofold and Rincewind again, and they're going on some crazy shenanigans. I actually liked The Light Fantastic a little bit more than The Color of Magic. Not by much, but I was a little bit more engaged in it, so I'm considering that a little bit of a win. But Terry Pratchett is a little bit nonsensical and fun, and this was another one of his parody books, I believe. It was a parody on fantasy, on typical, your typical fantasy. And it's really fun and really amusing at times. So I enjoyed it, but it was definitely not the best thing I've ever read. Then we get to another one of my favorite books of the year so far, and that is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Wow, did I love this book. I'm a little skeptical because of the hype, but I ended up really, really, really loving, and I mean loving, this book all time. It was so well done in every way. And I mean, while I saw a lot of the twists that were coming, it didn't detract from my enjoyment really at all. And I was just so captivated by the characters and the story that was being told. And it was just very, very well done, very well researched. And while I'm still on the fence about picking up some of other Taylor Jenkins Reid's works, this was one that I definitely enjoyed a whole ton. And then I picked up Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, which is the second book in the Six of Crows duology / trilogy or series or whatever. I think I heard there's supposed to be more books set in that part of the world. And I was pleasantly surprised. I actually ended up really, really enjoying Crooked Kingdom. I was a lot more invested in this leg of the story than any other Leigh Bardugo book. Probably because of Jesper and Wylan. They were in this book a lot more than Six of Crows in particular. I mean, they're not in Grisha. Grisha's just somewhere else. Like, I don't care. Crooked Kingdom thoroughly surprised me, and I ended up enjoying it quite a bit. For a lot of different reasons. Was it still the best thing I've ever read? No, but I was able to at least be immersed in it and actually interested in it, rather than kind of relatively distant and not really engaged. So I call that a huge achievement, and the fact that I was just into it and wanted to keep reading it, huge achievement. Loved it a whole lot. I also read Luck in the Shadows by Lynn Flewelling. It's like a fantasy novel. It's very, very 90s fantasy. And I don't know how to describe the premise very well to you guys, but it takes place in a world where sexuality is just really not a care. Like, it doesn't matter. And it seems like they're going in a direction where the two main characters are going to be in a relationship, which is kind of neat. But the plot was interesting, and the characters are definitely where this book shines. The world building was interesting. The writing was only okay, but certain aspects of the plot, I don't know, it just felt very disjunct. Like, there was a lot of action, and then there was like nothing, and then there was a lot of action, and then there was nothing, and I was just like, whiplash. So I don't know, just something about it didn't sit right with me, and it took me a lot longer than I was expecting to get through it. And it's a pretty short book. It's like around 400 pages long, and it took me like nearly a month to get through. So I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it a lot, but like at the same time, like when I walked away from it, I wasn't yearning to get back to it. So I'm not sure how I feel about it. And then the next one I read was The Bones of You by Laura Stone. This was a reread for me, and as you guys know, I talked about it quite a bit on my channel. I just have a lot of strong memories associated with that book and whatnot, but this reread made me see it in a little bit of a different light this time, and that it's not the best thing I've ever read. But the thing about it is because I have the nostalgia with it, I'm giving it, I still enjoyed it, but like I recognize that it's not that great. Like the plot is interesting and is kind of cute, but the characters are super irritating a lot of the time, and the writing is very underdeveloped in a lot of ways. There's really no world building because it does take place in our world, and it's kind of a contemporary. But I've read better contemporaries recently, and I'll be talking about one shortly, than that one. But I do still have a lot of nostalgic feelings for it. So next one I read was Truth Witch by Susan Dennard. I read this pretty quickly, and it was because it was very engaging. I adored the world building. I fell madly in love with the world building, and certain characters I also really liked. The plot at times was a little bit like front heavy, but once it kind of evened itself out about a quarter of the way through the book, I enjoyed it a lot more. The writing was also a little bit messy at times, but as I said, once we got like a quarter of the way through-ish, then it started to even itself out, and it got a lot better as the book went on, and I'm definitely looking forward to continuing on with that series. Then the second to last book that I read is The Sea Ain't Mine Alone by C.L. Beaumont. This is the author's debut novel, and it is an LGBT sports romance that takes place in the 1970s in California and Hawaii, respectively. And basically, it's about surfing. And it's really, really well done. It has a nice balance of romance and surfing, but I do want to tell you guys that this book is very adult, so if you're not into super graphic sex scenes, this book is probably not for you, but I definitely really enjoyed it. The writing and the characters are so captivating. The world building or the setting really, really draws you in, especially since it seems like the author has either done her research or lives or has lived in that area. She just did a really, really phenomenal job with everything, and it's a very immersive book. It really makes you feel like you're there, like you're experiencing things along with these characters. So I definitely, definitely enjoyed that book a whole lot. And then last, but certainly not least, because this book is definitely vying for to be in my top 5 of the year, probably, and that is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. Friends, I am obsessed with this book, okay? Like, legitimately obsessed with this book. It's brought up a lot of feelings and a lot of memories of things that I haven't thought about for a long time. And if you know me, I think about all kinds of things all the time. But yeah, it went deep and into the archives of my memory and just pulled all of this stuff out, and I'm like, wow, that's stuff I haven't thought about in at least like a year or two. So yeah, I had a wonderful, incredible ride with this book, right? Okay, so basically the premise of it, and if this doesn't hook you right away, is it's a romance novel between the president's son, so the first son of the United States and the Prince of England. Right. Okay. So it was just I cannot properly express my feelings on this book. I literally adored it and I want to reread it again immediately, but like at the same time that's not going to happen. Or maybe it's already happened and you don't know about it yet, but like literally I'm obsessed. There is great bisexual representation. There is great like, adultness, because it's definitely new adult. It's not YA. These characters are in their 20s friends. And they read like they're in their 20s. And just the content in it is something that caters to people like 20 to 30s range. And it's just I'm a fan of seeing something like that for once in my life because it's just so refreshing and so nice, and it's just nice to see that it's done in a really well done way. There is a lot of, once again, sexual content in this book, but it's a lot of like fade to black, and it's like, but you still know what happened and what's going on kind of thing, but it's not like super graphic. Like The Sea Ain't Mine Alone is definitely an adult romance novel. This is definitely catered to a younger-ish audience in some ways than The Sea Ain't Mine Alone, but like anyone can read either of those, whatever, you get the point. But I thought it was really well done. I was obsessed with Alex and Henry. Like, I love them so freaking much. I can see myself in both of them. Like, Alex's story of figuring out his sexual identity is very reminiscent to my own. It didn't happen that way, but it happened in a similar-ish way. And so I was just like really a big fan of that, and it kind of helped me sort through some things some more in some ways. So I was like, yes, this is good. But I am like pretty much 100% like Henry. Like I am that emotional, romantic, sappy, like classicist, love the classics to read, like soft person. Like I am literally Henry in so many ways. Like I have the outgoing personality of Alex, but I am like literally the personality of like everything that Henry embodies. So that was just like wild to see myself in both the characters in like such a huge way. It was like, wow, I'm literally reading about myself here. But also in some ways, like at the beginning, like when I read the premise and when I like started it out, I was like, oh, this could be a really, really great like idea for a Merlin and Arthur fanfic. But then as I started going, I was like, okay, wait, like this is 10 times better than what I was expecting it to be. And I just fell madly, madly in love with them. And it's definitely a book that I plan on rereading over and over and over again because I just loved it. And it just put me in such a good, happy mood. And yeah, I was a fan of everything. And I just want to talk to people about this book. Like, I don't care that I'm still studying for bar stuff. Like, please, if you've read it at this point, which hopefully a lot of you have by now, come talk to me because I want to scream with people about this book because I just love it so much and I'm ready for that. So, yeah. But anyway, those are all of the things I've read so far this year. I've read, as I said, 32 things from January till like late mid-May. And I'm excited to start reading things again come August sometime. But other than that, that's about all I've got for you guys today. So as always, you know the drill. I have both of my social media links down below in the description. I have a Twitter, which is at a sea of tones, which is the same as my handle here. And I also have a Goodreads, which is also linked down below where you guys can go over there and see what I've been reading and follow my progress and see my general superficial thoughts on things before I come scream at you about them over here. I've also started including my ships and fandoms page because people seem to be interested in that, so I also have that link down below for you guys as well. And I'd be curious to know if any of you guys have read any of these books. Feel free to talk to me via any means. And I will catch you later in another video for you guys again soon. Okay, bye.